Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we have an exciting episode for you on how not to be salesy. And back by popular demand, we're joined by Willemina. How are you doing?
Good, good. Excited to be back.
Yes, and today we are talking about salesy, or quote unquote salesy, because I think this topic is one that a lot of us as agents, we don't want to be known as salesy. We don't want to be that salesy person, but we still want to get sales. So we kind of have this like tug back and forth of how much or how far should we push when it comes to actual salesiness, if that's even a word. I don't even think it is, but how far do we push and what do we do in order to actually acquire the business without pushing people or feeling slimy about it? So it should be a pretty fun topic. So to kick things off, why don't we start with this? What comes to your mind when you think of how not to be salesy?
Yeah, so I think really it's a mindset thing for the agent, I would say. So coming from a perspective of or a mindset of educating the client rather than selling the client. And I think just making that shift in your mind makes a really big difference. So if you come at it from an approach and a mindset of, I have knowledge that will help the client make good decisions, that is, I think, very powerful, and that changes the whole tune. And you're not trying to push people to do things or to make decisions, but you're providing them with everything they need and providing them with all the factors to help them make that decision.
Yeah, and I think that's really the premise behind what we're getting at here today. It's the fact that knowledge is sales. Like knowing your product and knowing how to sell real estate and knowing the market is in fact sales. And we tend to think of sales as like, what's the secret code word or the secret sauce that we need that's going to convert somebody? Well, the secret sauce is knowledge. The more that we improve our ability to understand the market and communicate, the more we're going to sell. We don't actually have to have any sneaky scripts or anything like that. Knowledge is really where the sales comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I just think about, you're out with clients, you're showing them a home, and it's kind of that a client will pick up if you're just there and your only thing that you're discussing with them is, okay, well, do you want to put an offer? Like, well, are you ready? Do you want to buy this house? And it's just that take that away from thinking about, okay, are we going to write an offer on this property, but change it to, what's important about this house and what does the buyer need to be aware of if they want to buy this house? So pointing out things that may not be obvious, what's the property, what's in the neighborhood, what are some things to be mindful of, and knowing the market, being able to tell that client, say, hey, well, there was a similar one that just sold down the street. It sold quickly for this amount. Having that knowledge and having that discussion, that really helps the client decide whether or not they want to proceed with that home without them feeling like you're pushing them into something.
There's a lot of things coming to mind right now, but one of the main ones is when I first got into real estate, even through my first, I would say like 5 years, there was always this concept in the back of my mind that after showing a home, I should ask the person, do they see themselves in this home? And then if they say, yeah, I could kind of see myself, do you want to write an offer? And so that's kind of the general consensus, is asking people after they view a home, do they want to write an offer? And I remember this is one of my early on clients. I was asking that question, and I asked it of her after we left a condo. And I remember her thinking, she kind of like paused, and then she looked at me, and you would know who this client is. And she said, that question's making me really uncomfortable. And I came home after that and I thought a lot about that scripting around there. And I thought, you know what? She's right. Like, I'm asking her this question, do you want to write an offer, after showing her a property that she showed some interest in? And that should make her uncomfortable, because really what I'm trying to do in saying that is, let's move the process along. Let's move the process along. And so when that happened, I then shifted away from asking that question and instead started to discuss pros and cons, and also timing, in the sense, this property came on the market yesterday. There's a chance that it could be gone in the next 24 hours. Is that an issue or not? If it's not an issue, that's fine. If it is an issue, we can move on it. The other thing that I think you said that was super important was around pointing out non-obvious things. And I think we could extend that to even obvious things. Like, point out things that you think are obvious and point out things that potentially you think are not obvious. But this all kind of comes down to the fact is, how do we build this knowledge? How do we build this knowledge so that we're able to sell with knowledge without actually trying to push somebody?
Yeah, and I just want to add one more thought to that. When you said pointing out things, one quick tip for that, I would say, is when you're doing a CMA, like a comparative market analysis report, think about the things that would add or subtract value to the home. Those are the type of things I think that would be relevant to point out. So things that would impact the value. So maybe it's close to a busy road. Okay, so have that discussion. How does that factor in? But yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think things that impact a CMA, these are things that buyers don't tend to think about. Buyers are always thinking about resale. They're always wondering, will this hold its value? But we don't tend to bring up the fact of how comparisons actually work. And we don't tend to bring up what are value drivers and what aren't. The other spot where this goes for me is when we're helping somebody through a new construction, when they're building a house. And oftentimes we've all been there. I'm sure we've all been there where we've gone to list somebody's home and somebody's came through the house with us and listed off every single thing that they paid for with the builder. And you go through that list and you think nothing on here is driving any value. And that's where we can be of a huge assistance to people when they're thinking of buying as well.
Another example is, this is a few years back. I think you helped some clients, and they were dealing with a builder. They were buying new, and you were helping them, and they were deciding, and they picked the type of floor plan they wanted, but they were deciding on which lot to build on, and they were a little bit unsure. They didn't really value one much more over the other. There's one that was a little bit more expensive, but it was backing on to like a nature reserve, and the difference in lot value was quite minimal, but you said, okay, and down the line, this is going to be much more because of the no neighbors behind. And so they did end up choosing that lot, and down the line, that really helped them. And I think those are the type of things that's what a client is looking for. They don't want you to push them into something. They want a salesperson who's going to help them evaluate what are the things I should be thinking about and what's important here.
Yeah, totally. I think sales, I'm trying to go through my mind right now out of any sales process that I've been through, whether I've been buying a SaaS product or buying something else. What is it throughout those processes that has either caused me to buy or caused me not to buy? In almost all cases, the salesperson has knowledge and is not pushing me by any means, but instead is just educating me. And I think the more that we can start thinking through sales as education, we don't have to convince anybody. If we have the knowledge and we're able to communicate that, we don't have to convince a soul. They're naturally going to be drawn to work with us because of that.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that is like you said, it's making sure you have that knowledge, right? So if somebody's looking to say, how do I become that? I mean, it's a combination, right? Because there are two aspects. There's having that market knowledge. So that would be staying up to date on your market statistics. For instance, if that buyer is looking in a community, or even a seller looking to sell in that community, having that knowledge of, what's the average price here? How long does it normally take to sell properties in this area? And knowing that and being able to discuss that with the client. So the market knowledge, but then also the contract knowledge and knowing how to structure a deal and knowing which things are important, what kind of inspections based on what you're seeing in the home and what's important, knowing that. And then just a general experience. And I think being able to, this is one thing I think you do really well with clients, is you share stories of other clients who dealt with similar situations and then the outcome that they had. And that's a really great way to educate the person you're dealing with. But it seems it's a little bit softer when you say, hey, let me tell you the story about these clients, and you explain that scenario, rather than saying, well, this is what you should or shouldn't do. That's very harsh when you tell somebody, well, you shouldn't do this because it's not a good idea, but rather educate and say, let me tell you about a time when this happened.
The best conversion strategy is third-party stories. Is explaining what somebody else has done. And actually, on that note, I'll oftentimes use our own situation where we, on paper, overpaid for our house. Like if you were to do a CMA on our current house and what we paid for our current house, we overpaid. We were definitely those buyers that overpaid. But I have this conversation with buyers and I say, we overpaid. We definitely overpaid on paper, and we could not be happier that we did, because this home has value to us that potentially others won't see. So we really care about certain things, such as, say, nature. And so so this home, because it backs onto nature, was a huge value driver for us, where for others it may not. So these third-party stories can actually be extremely useful when we're thinking of conversion.
Yeah.
I think while we're on this topic too of discussing, I guess, how to actually communicate these things, it's worthwhile to bring up a couple of scripts that I'll tend to use very, very frequently. One is the whole script of I'm behind you 100% either way. And so using this script is sometimes buyers are on the fence. Should I write? Should I not write? Should I write this number? Should I not write this number? Should I increase my number? Should I not? And oftentimes before I actually make a suggestion, I'll say, just so you know, Willemina, I'm behind you 100%, regardless of whichever decision you make here, I'm behind you. I'm going to back you up. And then I go into the pros and cons. And then this allows me to start to get into the sales conversation by letting them know that regardless of which path they take, I'm not pushing them one way or the other. I'm not trying to convince them. I'm behind you either way. Here's our two options. Which one makes the most sense for you? Yeah. And the second one that I'll use at times is take off the salesperson hat. So sometimes people are going through a home, or maybe you're sitting down with the seller and the seller is like trying to figure out pricing. And all you have to say to them is, let me just take my salesperson's hat off for a second. And as soon as you say that, it just starts to create this connection where their guard is going to be let down. So let me take my salesperson's hat off for a second and let's look at pricing. And as soon as you say that, you can say the exact same thing. You just preface it by saying that, and then more trust is built.
Yeah. And I think that brings up and another important point is that I think it does the same thing where you ask that question and say, okay, I'm going to take my salesperson's hat off. The other way to do that is to just focus on listening to what your client is actually telling you. I think that's a skill that's really important as an agent to develop, because if you give the client an opportunity to talk and you truly listen and ask open-ended questions, ask follow-up questions, you start to figure out what's important to them. Because I think we've talked about this many times is with clients in general. There are three things, right? When you're dealing with buyers, there's price, there's location, and there's the house itself, like the kind of three important things to people. And we always talk about how generally people can only have two out of those three things. But we sometimes assume that the buyer knows what they want. We think, or we get frustrated when it's not easy to see what they want. And we say, well, you know, they're not making sense. They told me they don't want this, but they want to see this house. And sometimes we can get frustrated with the process. But I think sometimes it's good to take a step back and say, you know what, like they don't know what they want. But it's our job to help them figure out what's important to them. And I'd say this is another example was when you and I were looking for our house. We were like this. We didn't know what was most important to us. We had this list of criteria and we had these things and it took some time even for us to figure out what we wanted. And in our example, it ended up, we came to the conclusion that for us, outdoor space was really important. So that's why we now live right by a nature reserve. But that sometimes takes time to figure out, and it's having those discussions with clients. So for instance, when a client tells you they want to be in a specific neighborhood, why do they want to be there? Is it because they like is it because of the schools in that area? Do they have young kids that want to go to school there? Or is it because of the restaurants? They love going out to restaurants. Or do they have friends that live in that area and they just want to be close to their friends? Or what's the driving factor, right? And so when somebody tells you something, or so maybe they say, okay, we want a big house. Well, why do you want a big house, right? Is it because you have hobbies, or is it because you have a lot of company coming to visit? Like, well, what is the reason behind that criteria? And a lot of times it's that secondary question that gives you the information you need to do your job and to figure out what truly is the driving factor.
Yeah. The secondary question, I think, is key when we ask somebody, what's most important in the house? And they say kitchen. And then we think, okay, we're going to find them a nice kitchen. But the secondary question is, tell me more about that. And that's as simple as it can be. We don't have to come up with some elaborate question. It can be, tell me more about that. Can you explain that further? What about the kitchen? Do you spend the majority of your time in the kitchen? Where else do you spend the majority of your time? Mm-hmm. And these sort of secondary questions, and the one that I always fall back on is, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And then you're going to get into the actual reason behind their initial surface answer. Just for clarity too, you brought up the point of the three things. So just in case somebody hasn't heard what these three things are, what Willemina's touching on here is usually with buyers are going to want three things. They're going to want a nice home, or like the nice number or the right number of bedrooms. So they will need the right home. They need it in the right location, and they need it for the right price. So right home, right location, right price. A buyer can choose two of those things. So if they want the right home and the right location, their price may have to come up. If they need it below a certain price and they need a certain location, well, they may have to sacrifice more on the home. So that's more of that decision-making framework. But where I want to go with this is, how does one become a better listener? Because I think we all know we have to be better listeners, but honestly, most people are just not good at this skill. And it's something that I think I still am learning and will continue to learn. But how do we actually start to become better listeners? Because that is just not an innate skill that just comes to most of us, even if we think it does. Actually, I would even argue those people who think that they're really good listeners usually still need a lot of work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it goes back to what you said earlier about, knowing as an agent, okay, at the end of the show, you kind of want to ask what they thought of it. And I think the phrasing of how you ask these questions is very important, and knowing, but it's, and every client is also going to be different again. Like, some people will tell you what they're thinking at all times, and they kind of provide feedback as you go along with them. And then others are just closed and they keep everything inside, and you just don't really know, right, what's important. So it's a skill that you do learn over time. But what would you say are some tips and things? How can you get that out? Like, how can you ask those questions? And how can you be a better listener?
Well, I think the nature of the open-ended question, I even think that even the tell me more about that, the secondary question, is really helpful. And sometimes when we're asking questions though, so we've talked about this open-ended question, which I think is extremely important, but sometimes it can be really effective to use a close-ended question. And a close-ended question allows us to choose between A or B. So for an example of this, let's say we're looking at a house, and an open-ended question is like, what do you think of this house? A close-ended question would be, if this home was to sell tomorrow, would we be upset about that? And so sometimes asking these close-ended questions helps them make a decision, because they may say, no, I'm not too worried about that. We've seen a ton of homes. Perfect. Let's not worry about this one. Let's think about this one for a little bit. Or they might say, well, I'd be a little upset about that. And then we can kind of move them towards asking if it now is the right time for them to, usually what I say is throw your hat in the ring. So instead of me saying, do you want to write an offer on this one? I say, do you want to throw your hat in the ring? It's almost just a little softer way of getting them to start thinking about, okay, throwing my hat in the ring is just like giving it a shot. And sometimes we just need to think of it as giving it a shot, because we're not necessarily buying the home when we write an offer.
Actually, that's a good point. And I think that question or that statement, saying it that way with the hat in the ring, I think that does more than just offer a soft way to ask, but it also implies that there could be others wanting to buy the same property as well. So I think it also creates a bit of that, like, okay, somebody else could be considering this property as well, without pressuring or without creating that fear, but you are alluding to the fact that there could be others interested.
Yeah, exactly. And the other component is just having a set of questions. So if anybody wants my questions, you can always email me at michael@revrealestateschool.com, and I'll send you my list of questions, which does tend to change on a regular basis. But I just have these running list of questions that I will tend to ask. And oftentimes when we're thinking about listening to people, we don't always take into consideration the quality of our questions, but the quality of our questions is going to dictate the quality of the answers that they provide. And so whether you use my questions or whether you build your own or use some of mine or build your own, however you want to do that, you should have a list of questions that you take clients through and that you have at your disposal, because the quality of the question is really important. And now to kind of, I guess, not necessarily shift gears, but to change things ever so slightly, we've been talking a little bit about buyers. It seems like a lot of what we've been discussing right now is buyers, but I'd also like to move on over to sellers and to people that before they've actually signed a contract with us. So this would be a buyer who's choosing agents, or a listing where the seller is still interviewing agents. What is the nature, or how much should we be actually acting in a sales-like approach in these cases versus when we're out showing the home? Because I think when we're showing the home, it's not about being salesy. But what happens when somebody is choosing between us and somebody else? How do we approach that? And my initial thoughts on that are that when we are in a conversion setting, we do have to increase how quote unquote salesy we are. And there's one reason for that. And I don't want somebody to kind of misconstrue the thought of salesy meaning that I'm pushing the person, but salesy is meaning that I want the business. So we need to let the client know that we want their business, that we are going to work on their behalf, that these are the things that differentiate me versus another agent. These are kind of the things that we think about when we think of traditional sales, as differentiating ourselves and asking for business. And this becomes extremely important when we're trying to convert the client. And And oftentimes we don't want to push the client because we don't want the client to say no to us. So it's almost more of a fear response. We don't want the client to say no, so we never ask for the business. But the client, you have to think of yourself, when you're putting yourself in the shoes of a seller, they're going to want somebody who's driven, who's going to work, who's going to push, and who wants the business. I even think to the window guy that we had come through our house, and we got 3 quotes. We did the normal thing. We got 3 quotes, 2 of which were just like, come in, measure, boom, 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 done. And then the third one came in and said a couple of things. He said he specializes in homes like ours, and he really wants the business. And so automatically our minds went to, this salesperson is the one we want. Theoretically, the other 2 could have been great, but they came in, measured, here's your price. Where this guy came in and he said that I specialize in homes like yours, may not have even been 100% true. I don't even believe if that was fully true. It was like, our home requires new windows, and that's what he was able to do. And then on top of that, he said he really wants the business, and that's what helped convert him, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, put 2 people side by side, and the one specializes in exactly what it is that you need, and the other is more of a generalist. You're going to be more drawn towards the specialist, right? So I think there's different ways to say that. And I mean, you don't want to lie. If you're not specializing in something, you don't want to say that you are, but there are many different ways during a meeting with a seller in which you can, again, it comes back to this knowledge, right? It's how can you convey that you are the most qualified person for the job? I think that's truly, during a listing presentation, that's what the seller is there for. They're trying to answer the question, is this the best person for the job? And the job is selling my home, but you're selling the home as a realtor. You're getting hired for a lot of different skills, right? So I think one kind of way for some people will have different things that they focus on. So is it local expertise? Is it market knowledge? Is it your negotiation skills? Is it the type of marketing that you do? Like, again, it comes back to trying to listen to the client and seeing what's most important. What are some techniques, I guess, that you've developed over the years for that?
Yeah. So when I'm thinking about conversion, I would say probably 2 techniques that really, and they're actually along the same lines. First one is video email. So actually sending a video email after the listing presentation, thanking them, telling them how much you would love to represent them and how much you love their home, complimenting them on the beauty of their home and what they've done. Now, when you're talking about the whole idea of specialization, I think in many ways, like, you don't necessarily have to be like the geo-farming expert. Maybe you're doing a listing presentation on a home that was built in the 90s, and you could say, oh, I love 90s homes. I love the style. I've gone through a lot of homes and worked with a lot of homes that are in the 90s. This is really a vintage of home that I like. So I think that sometimes it's not necessarily just that we specialize in that exact type, but we can definitely massage it in a direction that makes the most sense.
Totally.
Now, the second thing beyond just the video email is actually sending the seller a small gift. I even think of last year, we had a really big listing, and this listing in particular, the seller was a huge reader and they had a huge library. And so following the listing presentation, just sent them my favorite book, got it directly from Amazon, got directly delivered to them in nice wrapping. And then we got the listing. Is that what caused us to get the listing? I don't know, but I'm sure it contributed to it. And so these sort of things are showing the person that you want the business. You're not just like, here's your CMA, let me know if you're interested, see you later. But you're also not sitting in the home and saying, I'm not leaving this home until you sign my listing contract, which is like the most off-putting thing ever. If anybody came into my house to list my home or do anything and said, I have to sign your contract before you leave the house, I'm not choosing you. You're not doing my windows. You're not cleaning my house, nothing. So that approach doesn't work either. There's kind of, how can you do this in a way that shows that you're interested while not trying to pressure the person?
So this actually reminds me of something that you've said before, which is the mindset that you should have about this is if you tell yourself, or if you believe that you are the best person to represent this seller, that the seller is basically losing out if they don't have you representing them, because you have that knowledge and that you can help them. And if you truly come from that, if you believe that, then you're naturally going to reach out in a way that you want to help them. You want to provide them. You want to share your knowledge and your information. And the seller is going to be better off by choosing you. They're going to be better off than if they choose, Joe agent down the street. If you embody that, then that confidence comes across, and then you're not being salesy per se, but you're being confident, and that to me, it's the same way with the window person that came and saying, oh, we've done many homes like this. We specialize in that, and we'd love to get this job. I mean, that excitement, people want to know that you will be a priority to them, that they're going to get all the attention that the listing needs and that they're making the best decision by choosing you.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. They have to feel confident that they're making the right choice, ultimately. The final thing I just wanted to touch on here before we wrap up is this concept of selling to our database. And I think oftentimes we're told that we need to be asking our database for business all the time. And I do not believe that that is the best approach with your database at all. So if we are constantly hounding our database for business, our database is going to shrink because those people are not going to be picking up our calls. They're not going to be responding to our emails or text messages. So when it comes to dealing with our database, let's really take off that salesperson's hat completely. Again, coming from a place of knowledge that we understand the market, but we're not necessarily asking for business. We don't have to ask for business at all. Instead, we just need to seed the fact that we're interested in receiving business. So maybe this is an email newsletters where we're saying, click here to make an introduction. I like the word introduction, by the way, instead of referral. So just by saying I'm open to your referrals, people don't understand what referral means. So use the word introduction instead. But ultimately, you do not need to sell to your database at all. We can just seed this throughout email newsletters and your email signature. And even when talking to people, I tend to use humor. So the way that I seed this in a conversation through humor is, hey, if you've ever wanted to have a new neighbor, or if you know somebody who wants to move into the neighborhood, these sort of things, they're just soft ways of saying that you're open to referrals without directly asking. Because as soon as we start directly asking, it does become a little bit more off-putting, and that becomes a little bit more challenging as we progress. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it plays back into the whole thing is like, you can ask for things from your database, but it needs to be, all those other things need to happen first, right? You need to follow up with them about other things and don't make it about you. I mean, if you talk about your own business and yourself once in a while, but you've already connected with the client about, their birthday or their home anniversary, or you're following up and see how their new job's going, and you're having all these conversations that are organic, then you open the door to a more natural conversation about referrals or somebody they know. Or a lot of times you won't even need to go that far because you're already top of mind. And so it's you want to be open about the fact that, yeah, absolutely, you would love to handle their friends and family in real estate, but yeah, it's sometimes it becomes a little bit awkward if you're straight up asking for it. Provide the value, and then I think that really does it. That gives those clients the confidence to refer their friends and family because they can see how good of a job you are doing with them.
Yeah, I don't think you really need to be asking for business. You can ask for business, and if that is part of your style, perfectly fine, go for it. But you want to be cautious. If you're comfortable asking for business, do it maybe once a year max. If you're doing it more than that, and that's provided that you're having, say, 4 conversations a year with that individual, keep it to once every 4 times, and don't ask them and ask for a name and ask for the phone number. Oftentimes you'll be asked to, like, what's their name? What's their phone number? What are they looking to buy? Can you make the introduction? No, just let them know that you're open to receiving other introductions if they know anybody who's looking to buy or sell. That's enough. And then now it's in their mind, and then you haven't also burned that relationship. Okay, thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out to us anytime at revrealestateschool.com, or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery, and Willemina is
Willemina _Montgomery.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in the next lesson.